Okay, so before we jump into the topic in question and make sense of this film, I'm going to spend a fair bit of time contextualizing the divisive nature of the found footage subgenre, so bear with me here. At best, found footage is a powerful tool to reinforce the authenticity of a story and give a unique perspective to an otherwise traditional piece of fiction, and at worst, it's a flashy gimmick to excuse poor filmmaking and force the illusion of authenticity. Sure, to say its best and worst feature is how authenticity is utilized seems a bit contradictory, but given how sensibilities and audience sophistication has developed over the years, there's no escaping the fact that film, even in its most elaborate and fantastical form, still needs a certain level of grounded realism to emotionally connect with the viewer and help suspend their disbelief. As a result, in many cases, found footage has become the cheap and easy tactic to establish this emotional connection, because by simply de-emphasizing filmmaking structure for a homemade amateur aesthetic, it helps mask the production technicalities that can pull us out of the experience when we begin to notice them. And you could even say the raw, grainy feel of the footage heightens a certain nostalgic resonance when we think of home movies, family photos, and well, cherished memories in general. For many people, the reason it's so prolifically associated with horror is because the claustrophobia, darkness, chaos, and obscurity generated by the found footage technique perfectly fits the style of the genre. But honestly, I think it has more to do with how horror is so explicitly dependent on realism to be provocative. And what found footage essentially is an oddly accessible way of creating a feeling of verisimilitude, a profound truthfulness that is untouched by the cinematic artifice that doesn't reflect reality as it is. For example, when Cannibal Holocaust, a film I practically bring up in every other video, first put the technique to use by juxtaposing it with a traditional cinematic structure, it mirrored the archival footage used during wartime to reflect on destruction and social terror, where showing the horror through found footage added a gravitas that heightened this uncanny realism that contrasted with the clean contemporary style of filmmaking that was indicative of the familiar studio system artifice that invoked safety and escapism. Basically, instead of going for the leisurely classical Hollywood style, found footage somewhat became a mild embodiment of neorealism and new wave in European cinema, movements that very directly took the documentary-esque cinema verite approach of filming the world as it was to make their stories feel more real and personal. Then, when the Blair Witch Project came along and made found footage a phenomenon by being in the right place at the right time to reflect on technological advances in communication and culture, and emphasize the growing fears and anxieties of society around the turn of the 21st century, instead of leading to significant developments in the subgenre, what we got instead was 20 years of indecipherable shaky cam cliches, ominous jump scares, and monotone voyeuristic supernatural nothingness with unremarkable payoffs. While many found footage films depended on word of mouth or clever marketing tactics, we at least had some brilliant efforts that understood that there was an art to making something look cheap, like Wreck, The Bay, Lake Mungo, Behind the Mask, and the Poughkeepsie tapes, and even the occasional film that technically employed similar techniques in a conventional manner like Sinister and The Descent. But I don't think found footage ever reached its full potential as a result of being so easy to replicate without much of a budget, or dare I say, imagination. While we certainly got many subversive takes on the subgenre's tropes and cliches, I can only think of one film that truly deserves being considered the unofficial deconstructive satire of found footage movies. Except because it's not pop culturally Americanized, naturally not a whole lot of people have seen it. So let's talk about it. Of all the found footage movies out there about ghosts, killers, and demons, it's a nice change of pace to see a found footage film tackle something a little more, distinct, shall we say, which in the case of the appropriately titled Norwegian dark fantasy Troll Hunter is, well, trolls. You'd think, after talking about the necessity of realism and verisimilitude to generate a grounded connection with an audience, Scandinavian folklore would be the last thing I'd probably turn to. But make no mistake, for a story about a group of college students attempting to make a documentary about a suspected bear poacher, only to discover he's actually a troll hunter contracted by a government division known as Troll Security Service that maintain the secrecy of trolls, it's a surprisingly nuanced and genuinely creepy little film that makes a very convincing case for itself. If what I described to you sounds silly and ridiculous, that's because the film very blatantly is, to the point of shamelessly relishing in it with a completely straight face. Whereas a lot of oddball creature features of the modern era tend to have a B-movie level self-awareness to them, as a sort of playful homage to cult classic cinema, Troll Hunter is actually one of the very few films that, instead of acknowledging its self-awareness with shoulder-nudging references and over-the-top hijinks, firmly and confidently commits to taking itself as seriously as humanly possible, with the majority of the cast being well-known local comedians who ironically maintain the film's stern sincerity. There's a sort of deadpan, absurdist sense of humour to it, where we see these traditional fairy tale looking trolls and follow it up with a mysteriously ominous government force who treat them as hostile, terrifying wild creatures, no different from bears and other predators. In fact, as part of their cover-up operation, after our titular troll hunter Hans kills one of them, in comes the TSS to manipulate the scene to make it seem like a wild bear attack to keep the media and locals off the scent. It's kind of like South Park, where it doesn't call attention to itself, but rather plays off real-life observations, politics, and social behaviour, especially when the film ends by editing real footage of the Norwegian Prime Minister subtly name-dropping the existence of trolls by taking his oil field interview out of context, considering the field itself was called Trollfield. Troll Hunter is largely making fun of how serious most found footage films tend to be, despite their inherent goofiness and exaggerative hysteria. The film is so hyper-detailed with the inner workings of the government's operations, using recurring interviews that delve into the biology and lifestyle of the various trolls, to the point that, like the students, you become totally desensitized to its absurdity. What makes it so special is that it never breaks character to tell you that what you're watching is actually a lampoon of how overly serious fiction can be. While the film captures a lot of the raw, anxiety-inducing intimacy of the Blair Witch Project, it's even more effective that the CG trolls feel so naturally placed within the grainy handheld footage. Yeah, sure, it's easy to dismiss the film as a low-budget European Cloverfield, but whereas Cloverfield certainly had flair, you knew it wasn't real because it had a Hollywood studio emphasis on spectacle. Troll Hunter, on the other hand, doesn't actually aim for spectacle. In fact, if anything, it downplays it to the point of irrelevancy. What I mean by this is that the film's satire is wrapped up in how it toys with authenticity. As I said earlier, found footage can practically become a smokescreen to make a premise seem realistic, and Troll Hunter embraces this by making its story as cheesy and borderline cartoonish as possible, that in theory should take you out of the experience by making it difficult to suspend your disbelief. I mean, come on, Troll Security Service, that's fucking dumb, but its found footage style feels maturely appropriate against the backdrop of its cold, tangible setting and modest characterization, that it adds an overarching sense of melancholy to the story. Rather than trying to cleverly subvert tropes and cliches or indulge in deliberate B-movie quirkiness, it makes Hans' job out to be stressful, mundane, and well, depressingly ordinary. The tone of the film is fairly monotonous, even somewhat indifferent you could say. While this is a big surprise to the students at first, they quickly start to sympathize with Hans' disillusionment that the trolls are almost secondary to Hans' gradual humanization. He actually becomes the biggest mystery to the story. When the students get permission to follow him, he uses it as an opportunity to expose what the government is up to by laying everything out on the table, that by the end there's no longer any mystique to the trolls. You practically learn everything there is to know about them. They become just another wild animal trying to survive like everything else, with the film dismantling the comedic perception of their appearance by having Hans openly rebuke the inaccuracies theories and misconceptions of fairy tales we're familiar with as undermining the true reality, kinda like misconceptions thrown at other wild animals infamous for their supposed dangerousness, when in reality human ignorance is usually to blame for provoking them in the first place. The thing about Hans is that he's bored by it all, almost seemingly representing our dwindling wonder now that fantasy is so commonplace, to the point that it doesn't really have any excitement or surprise anymore. We get small hints of the life Hans wants away from his isolating soul-destroying lifestyle, that when he goes out to give the mega big boy troll the final blow, he then just disappears. Granted, it's implied Hans plans to retire once he's figured out why the trolls are acting so out of place by finding the troll that's discovered to be spreading rabies this entire time, much to the presenter's dismay because he's bitten by a troll early in the film. Yeah, he's now got rabies, so he's fucked regardless. Hell, what makes the ending even more grim is that the students all go missing, suggesting that the government disposed of them somehow despite being unable to retrieve the footage, thus reinforcing this sinister, believable undertone to a film that starts out kinda goofy. If there's a positive in there somewhere, it's the hope that maybe Hans finally found the way out that he wanted, so that it isn't totally nihilistic. But that's what makes Troll Hunter all the more impactful. It's a silly idea committed to selling you on its real possibility. It seems to highlight our obsession with realism and believability when it comes to cinema, and in the process, because it makes its fantasy so convincing, it challenges this cynical assumption that movies are unrealistic when you think about them too long. I guess to conclude, I like to see Troll Hunter as a kind of criticism to sardonic movie critics and nitpickers. A kind of fuck you to people who get so caught up in plot holes, logical missteps, and wanting a justification for every fine detail that they forget the bigger picture of the experience. That you're watching a movie to escape the mundane verisimilitude of your own reality. So relax, enjoy the ride. It's all just a bit of harmless fun. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode and you enjoy what I do here and you want to support the show, get early access, vote on future videos, get your name in the credits, and get access to our exclusive Discord community where you can tell me what you've been watching, playing, reading, and just share all sorts of crazy nonsense you've been up to, then please do consider heading over to Patreon, where for just a few dollars a month you will get access to those features, and most importantly, you will help this show thrive and survive going into 2020, which is way too futuristic now that I've said that out loud. Anyway, until next time, stay very, very safe, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!